Hi, everybody. This is Nell with CAEE. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes, just giving folks a couple more seconds to get online. Oh, yeah, and please feel free to put into the chat where you're coming from, because I was in charge of the registration and I saw a lot of exciting emails from all over the place. All right, fantastic. Looks like we got folks from all over. California, Arizona, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Nell Champlin-Nelson, and I am the Event and Program Coordinator for the Colorado Alliance for Environmental Education. And today's webinar is Telling Your Environmental Story with ESRI Story Maps. And shortly, you'll be hearing from Joseph Kerski. I'm going to go through just a few housekeeping items before we jump in, and then I'll turn it over to him. So if you're not familiar with CAEE and the work that we do, we are a network of environmental education providers who are working together to advance environmental education in Colorado by fostering collaboration, mobilizing support, and driving excellence. And so one of the ways that we try to drive excellence is through this monthly webinar series. It's an opportunity for us to come together and to share and spark ideas and to hear about some new and innovative tools that we can incorporate into our practices. Also, I just wanted to let you know that we have a couple things on the horizon that I wanted you to be aware of. So on April 3rd and 4th, we have our 20th annual Advancing EE Conference. The conference is going to be at Snow Mountain Ranch in Granby, Colorado. Registration is still open, and if anybody has questions or if you need help registering, feel free to shoot me an email. I will actually send a follow-up email to this webinar, so you'll have my contact information. And then if anybody is thinking about submitting a portfolio to become a certified environmental educator, the spring deadline is April 10th. We might have a little bit of flexibility there. We might be able to extend it about 3 or 4 days, but just know that that's coming up. And then I also would like to take a moment to thank our webinar series sponsor, Marathon. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to offer these awesome resources to the EE community. And then just a little tech note, if some of you are not familiar with Zoom, I just thought I would give you a little overview here. So I have everybody muted, but if you're having any technical issues, or if you're interested in asking questions or sharing a comment, please feel free to do it in the chat box. It looks like most of you have found it so far, but it is circled in the picture on the screen. And I'll be monitoring that throughout all of this afternoon, so feel free to put those comments and questions in there. And then this webinar is being recorded, and I will send out a link to the recording, as well as any of the resources that Joseph mentioned today, so you can have those in the future. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce you to today's guest speaker, Joseph Kerski. Joseph is a geographer with a focus on the use of geographic information systems, GIS, in education. Joseph was the president of the National Council for Geographic Education in 2011. He's served as a geographer in 4 major sectors of society, including government, academia, private industry, and the nonprofit sector. He has authored over 75 chapters and articles on topics such as GIS, education, physical and cultural geography, mathematics, fieldwork, teaching and learning, and much more. He has also authored or co-authored 7 books, and in 2018, he gave a presentation on the whys of where at TEDx Vail, focusing on the importance of mapping and geotechnologies in education and society. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Joseph.
Many thanks, Nell. Greetings all. Good to see your happy faces there online. Joseph Kerski here at your service. We are going to have a short but hopefully intense and meaningful dive into the world of story mapping and also in the world of web GIS. So as Nell was saying, I'm very happy to be here. This is intended to be a confidence building sort of a session. In other words, that you will have some skills, but you'll also have, more importantly, the confidence that, hey, I can do that. I can, and I know the whys of why I should do that. I know the reasons why I should do that, and I also have some skills in terms of carrying me forward after the webinar ends. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel my video here so that we can save on a little bit of the bandwidth. But the point is, I am at Esri, at Environmental Systems Research Institute. Here's a little bit about me. Nell was very kind to share a little bit about my role, but just to reiterate what she was saying, we have a great group of people on here representing some of the things that I've got some toes in the waters over the last decades. Private industry at Esri, federal agencies. Most of my career has been at NOAA, Census, USGS. I also teach at the University of Denver, at North Park University, and a couple of other places. So again, very happy to be with all of you. One of the things I'm really passionate about is helping people be critical of data, understand where it comes from, who created it, what scale it was created at, and being able to make more informed decisions about how to use it, especially geospatial data. In today's world, we have, as you'll see here on this webinar, no shortage of spatial data. Much of it is actually crowdsourced. What does that mean for data quality implications? That means you've got a whole plethora of vetted and unvetted information at your fingertips. Much of it is very good. Some of it is questionable. Some of it looks good, but you don't know what the source is. So this Spatial Reserves data blog is not just about where to find data and how to know if it's any good, but I also talk about, and I want you folks to use it as a resource for teaching and learning about, again, being critical of data, especially mapped data, which tends to have an air of authenticity to it. In other words, we tend to think that mapped data is perfect, that is created by authoritative sources like the agencies I mentioned earlier, national mapping agencies, for example, science agencies. Those agencies created data for years and years. It was never perfect to begin with. It all has data quality constraints on it. But the point is that we have no shortage of data at our fingertips. Indeed, we are in the era of data. And one of the things that I have in this blog that we write every week to is, for example, getting students and others to think about things like location privacy and data quality and crowdsourcing. So last week I wrote about, maybe some of you saw this article about a person that wheeled 99 smartphones around in a wagon in London to create fake traffic jams on Google Maps. Really interesting. So things like that that present these topics in an interesting and engaging way. In other words, thinking about a data blog off the top probably seems like the most boring thing in the world, right, folks? But the idea is this could be a good resource for you. I hope it is. Now, Nell mentioned I work for Esri, the Environmental Systems Research Institute. Let me just show you briefly what our mission is. Education, sustainability, and science. So esri.com, and I'm just on the About tab. Education, sustainability, and science. The education program here goes way back to 1992. So we have a whole team of people to support your good work in research, teaching, and also on the admin side of education, school bus routing, campus safety, alumni networks, campus infrastructure mapping, etc. So I know many of you are not in education, but for those of you that aren't, talk to someone in education about the resources from CAEE and also the story maps that we're going to share today in the webinar. But this is our mission. Think of us as your industry partner. All of us on the education team are not just tasked or assigned to work in education. We actually are educators just like you, and we love engaging people at all levels and in all disciplines about why, where matters. That is our focus. So the education space, we'll talk more about this as the webinar gets rolling later on about, hey, how can I actually get an account to actually make story maps? We'll talk more about this in a bit. But this is the landing page for education, just esri.com/education will get you to this page. And it talks a little bit about, okay, higher education, schools, lifelong learning, libraries, museums, 4-H clubs, Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, etc. Okay, so I would like to begin our discussion about story maps with the following. If you go to this page right here, I'm going to paste it into the chat box. And if I do that, I want you to participate in a story map, which is very fitting for today's discussion. And inside the story map, you'll see it's about walkability, a very nice environmental, a pertinent, relevant environmental theme. So here's a survey that I have inside the story map. So this story map is, as you can see on the screen here, walkability. And if you scroll down a little bit in that link that I've got in the chat box, you'll see a click to submit point. If you click the submit point inside the story map, this runs Survey 123. Survey 123 is some of you may have used Google Forms or SurveyMonkey in the past. Great tools, easy to use. This is very similar to that in that it is quite easy to drag and drop true, false, multiple choice, Likert scale, etc. into a form to go out into the field and then collect data. Whether it's you and your team collecting data or people that are not inside your group of colleagues, maybe the general public even. So in this particular one, it's completely open, and you will see that you do not need any sort of login to access the survey. So again, I went to the link in the chat box, I scrolled down a little bit to submit point, and then I see what is the walkability of this location? Now, those of you that know me know I'm very passionate about walking and walkability and walkable communities. So I have, hey, is this site right now, with this place that we're interested in, pedestrian friendly or unfriendly? And then rate it, and then tick all choices. Does it have dangerous cross traffic, obstructions, etc.? And then of course, germane to what you and I are talking about today, where is it located? And then, hey, do you have a photograph of it? If so, go ahead and submit that. So if I go back to my story map, and we'll talk about how this can be built in a bit, but the nice thing about what I call modern GIS or modern geographic information systems is that many of them are web enabled. They're running it online, software as a service, or SaaS. And this is the result of the survey that is now being fed in real time to this particular map. So if I click over here in South Dakota, wow, okay, pedestrian friendly right there, that's great. Is there a photo in that location? No. But what about this location right here? Interesting. So the point is, I've got this live feed coming in, and a couple months ago I taught down in Australia, so good on you, mate. She'll be right. So here is a image that I took. This probably looks familiar to many of you, looking over Sydney, and okay, that was pretty walkable right there, and so that's why I rated it pedestrian friendly. Okay, interesting. This particular place, this was a landfill. Some of you may question why a geographer goes out to a landfill, but the point is, this is not too walkable, and also maybe that could be a good indication for you to think about another kind of survey that you could make on, for example, types of litter that you see up on the landscape. The point is, the survey is being fed into this story map. And another thing that I wanted to point out is that we've got another tool called a dashboard. And my survey is being fed into this dashboard. So I have these questions, as you saw in the survey, and they are reflected in the dashboard. So right now, I've got 314 points that people like you have submitted to this survey. I've got a little legend here. I've got the pie charts showing the results of the current results of the survey. And guess what? This same dashboard is being used in other places. So for example, some of you may have seen this, the coronavirus outbreak dashboard. Okay. Interesting. So if we take a look at that, we've got these dashboards being deployed by people all over the world. Why? Because we've got issues, right, about human health, about water, about energy, about natural hazards. These are also used heavily several weeks ago during the bushfires in Australia. So the point is that these tools that we're talking about today, people are actually using out in the workplace. So I think there are a number of compelling reasons to use story maps and these other tools. So go ahead and submit your results if you'd like to for a place maybe that you've got a photograph of that you've walked, and we will come back to how to connect these components in a bit. Okay, so let's talk about what is a story map, why it's important, and so on. Okay, so a story map, I'm going to move some of these boxes around a little bit, is a web mapping application, So it lives online, it's interactive. As you saw in some of those maps that I was just interacting with a moment ago, you've got things that you can click on, you can zoom and pan, you can pull up a legend, you can do things with it, you can measure, you can add data to some of them, etc. So they're interactive maps, and they've got multimedia, audio, video, text, narrative, etc., to tell stories about the world, local to global scale. For example, about trees or walkability, as I showed, or human health. They work on a variety of different devices. They're enabled to work on different devices without any coding required. And they incorporate these interactive builders that I'll illustrate here in the webinar today, where you're basically clicking on, oh, I want a subheading. Oh, I want an image. Oh, I want a slideshow inside there. So these tools are easy to use. And as the Story Maps platform evolves, every time it updates, it gets easier to use and more powerful. So keep in mind that these tools are rapidly advancing, and that is actually good news for you and I as educators. They're hosted by Esri in the cloud, so there's nothing you actually need to store on your own computer. They have grown in popularity, as you can see right here. We have over 1 million story maps, and that's not just me and my colleagues here at Esri creating them. More importantly, it's people like you that have created these to tell a story about your community or something you're passionate about or some research you're working on. So late last year, we went over 1 million story maps. There are about 3,000 new story maps being created daily inside this ArcGIS platform that I'll talk about here in a moment. And organizations are using story maps, and you can read them for yourself, what organizations use story maps. It's basically nonprofits, federal agencies, private companies, academia, schools, etc. Story maps are being heavily used by education. In fact, there are more educators using story maps than any other sector, which is pretty exciting for us as educators. And this is the landing page to go and learn more, as I'll delve into in a bit. So that's the essence for what is a story map. And I have a couple of other things that I would like to add in addition to that. First of all, this whole idea of where these story maps live. Hopefully you're seeing this ArcGIS as a platform. Just like other tools that you've used in the past few years, folks, you have very few things now that are solely local on your computer, correct? You're using Google Maps, you're using Google Docs, you're using OneDrive, you're using Flickr, you're using Amazon Music, you're using Apple Music, etc., right? You've got a lot of stuff that's up on a server somewhere, and you don't really care where it is as long as it'll work, right? As long as you can access your data at any time, anywhere. And that's the beauty of not just story maps, but that's just the beauty of GIS, or Geographic Information Systems, in the 2020s. Because name some issues on our planet. We could have a discussion: water, energy, human health, economic inequalities, right? Environmental degradation, species loss, acidification of the ocean. I mean, other things that, as Nell was talking about, CAEE and other organizations are grappling with. And why we're so passionate about GIS is that these issues are complex. It involves lots of different disciplines, lots of different stakeholders, lots of different people with different expertise, and hence GIS tools up in this cloud-based environment allows us to collaborate and solve these pressing issues that are complex and increasingly affecting our everyday lives. So that's what really excites me. More than the technology, it's this whole collaborative effort. And so WebGIS of which ArcGIS is a part of. ArcGIS is the particularly Esri flavor of WebGIS, but you've got apps. You've got desktop tools, you've got web tools, and you've got mobile tools. You've got this portal where geographic data is being managed by organizations. And you and I, as consumers of that data, and also we're producing data, as you just created and illustrated a moment ago. If you've submitted any data to my walkability map, you've created data. You've created some information. So you've got some information there that you've created and also information that other people have created. And you've got ready-to-use content of all kinds. In particular, with the Living Atlas of the World and other resources, you've got watersheds, ecoregions, population change, you name it. You've got a lot of geographic information at your fingertips. Might be a topic for another webinar. But here's a couple of advantages for what I believe are compelling reasons for using story maps, not just in education, but beyond. And you can read these for yourself, but you can teach content. I'll illustrate that in a moment. It fosters tech skills, not just geographic information systems tech skills, but things like, do I have permission to use that image in my story map? Good things to have people think about, students and beyond, right? Also, on the instructional side, it's a good way for you to assess student work. So if your students submit a story map on tsunamis of the Pacific over the last 50 years, you can have a rubric that assesses their work. They can present a 5-minute presentation using their story map as their tool, as their presentation tool. Now, I still use Prezi and Sway and PowerPoint, sure, but I also use story maps to present with. It supports research. And there's also some research about, it's not just Joseph saying that this is a good idea. Here's a recent article from a couple of colleagues of mine over in Spain about the effectiveness of using WebGIS for secondary education, in this case using a digital atlas that they created for schools. So there's some research increasingly to back this up, that there are many good things that have come out of students engaging in this kind of work. And finally, foster communication skills and understanding. In other words, we're not just saying, hey, create a story map on tsunamis of the Pacific or litter or water quality. It's, what have we learned about that? And then what can we do about, let's say, declining water tables or declining quality of our water in our local watershed or whatever it is? What can we do about it? GIS has existed since the late 1960s, and it was always intended to be a problem-solving tool, a tool that we can actually use to deal with these pressing issues on our planet. So these are just a couple of examples. Now, how do you create one of these? I'm going to illustrate this in a moment. Hope you folks are doing okay. How's everybody doing out there? Everybody doing okay? Nobody's checking their email or anything else? Okay, hopefully this is engaging. But there are 3 main methods in the way I think about this to create story maps. I'm going to guide you through, oh, thanks, John, the builder tools. It's the easiest, gentlest, gluten-free way of making story maps, okay? Bite-sized, gluten-free way of making story maps. There's also method 2. You create a map inside this platform called ArcGIS Online. You share it, and then one of the choices you get is, hey, do you want to create a story map from your web map? Yes, please. Let me see what the choices are. Nice. And then method 3, we won't get to today, but I just wanted to let you know that you can actually download these configurable apps and upload them to your own website, okay, your own website, as I'll illustrate here in a moment, okay? So those are the 3 main methods of creating this. Let me show you that method 3. We're starting in reverse here. But this is one of my favorite story maps from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game because of a couple of reasons. Number one, it illustrates the method 3, which is, notice it's on alaska.gov, okay? So these services are still in the ArcGIS framework, but it's being hosted on the alaska.gov page, the whole story map with tabs, okay? So, hey, we're in Anchorage, we've got bears. How do we deal with bears? And so in this particular case, you've got this kind of thing going on where they've got these collars on these bears. So you can see the snout of the bear. Hopefully here, I'll just pause the video. But the point is, how do we educate the community to effectively live with bears? Okay, that is done effectively, I think, with story maps. It's got the location of where these bears were collared, and a little video. Every time I think I have a challenging day at work, I tell myself, Joseph, at least you're not collaring grizzly bears. You've got it pretty easy. But the point is that this is a very effective, I think, way of showing the community, okay, how do we deal with where we live on the planet? And the Alaska Department of Fish and Game has hosted that one. Okay, so the idea here is that we've got three main ways of creating these story maps. Now I'm going to go back to where I was earlier. Just give me a moment here. Yep, I wanted to show this one as well. So here's an example story map from the Nature and Environment collection. So if you go to storymaps.arcgis.com, I'll put that in the chat box here. If you go there, you will see some collections. And one of the ones I wanted to show is down here in the Forest Atlas. So remember I was saying before that story maps are you can actually teach content with story maps. So if I want to go into, hey, where are the mangrove forests? Interesting. Why do they have this spatial pattern that they do? And let's look at forest loss, and let's look at tree cover gain. Okay, so it's not all doom and gloom. It is there's some reason for hope here. What are some drivers of deforestation? Okay, urbanization, commodity-driven, as you can see in central Brazil, etc. So this is a very, I think, effective illustration for, you can use story maps to teach a key concept. What's a biome? What's an ocean current? Where do the ocean currents exist? Where are forests? Where are forests threatened? Etc. Okay, so key content, key themes in not just environmental studies, but we could have another session on, and I do for other groups, about population, about health, about business, lots of ways that you can teach core content with story maps. So that's just one illustration, okay? So the point is that I'm going to close a couple tabs, folks, just to maintain sanity. So those are a couple of examples of story maps. The other thing that I wanted to illustrate here, let's go back to where we were at this point. There's some teachable moments that I'll illustrate when we actually go through making one of these. There are a lot of tabs, as I've just illustrated, and make sure that you know which tab you're logged into or signed into. More about that in a moment. Give some context of where your story map, your issue, the problem that you're addressing is located. Oftentimes we see some really compelling story maps and we have no idea where it is. It may be an extremely local event or issue in some community somewhere, and you have to do a little digging to find out where that is. Give some content and also context of where your community, your issue is located. Use folders inside ArcGIS Online to organize your work. There are a lot of pieces with story maps. Obviously, there are where are your photos going to be? Where is your video going to be? Where's your text going to be? So use folders and keep life as simple as possible. Model, as I hinted earlier, good practice of the permitted use of imagery. So U.S. federal agencies that are non-copyrighted, those images, or images you've taken yourself, or that you've actually secured permission from someone to use. And also be mindful of the image size. You're working on the web here, so if you've got a story map with 100 monstrously huge images, because your device happens to take these 20 megabyte images, well, maybe 100 images at 20 megabytes each is not such a good idea for bandwidth. Be mindful of that. You can choose to ignore my advice, folks, but then your story maps may become sorry maps. Your story maps will become sorry maps. Oh my gosh, that's such a bad joke, Nell. Sorry. All right, 3 key points before we go into how do I create one of these. As I hinted at earlier, this is a dynamic, web-based software as a service environment where the tools update quarterly. So if you're going to say, hey, I want to document this for my students to actually go through step by step and I'm going to screenshot everything, do not do that. First of all, there's plenty, as I will explain in a moment, of resources for you to learn more about this in graphics format, in video format, etc. Don't get into this whole 10 years ago, we did need to screenshot things. You don't want to do that nowadays. No. They're too easy to use, and the tools expand quarterly. Yeah, but the good news is that every time they expand, you got more capability and you've got easier tools to use them. So all good. And also, I'm kind of breezing over this last part here in the webinar, but good planning makes for a good story map. So don't just plunge in and make one of these without thinking about, okay, who's my audience? Am I just going to share it with my own organization, with my own colleagues? Am I going to share this with the whole planet? If I'm a teacher or a professor, just my class at a university or a community college or at school? Who am I going to share it with? And then therefore, what kind of story map do I need to make? And then where are all the elements going to come from? So plan ahead is good. Just like when you go out in the field with your students, you plan ahead, you understand where you're going to collect data, what units you're going to use, what devices you're going to use to collect with, etc. There's no shortage of the types of story maps that you can actually use. These are just a few of the ones that you can make. The swipe, for example, story map, where you've got a sort of like a big squeegee that goes across the page. You've probably seen those. You can create those kinds of things. So the good news to me with story maps is that you can use existing story maps. So if you get out of this webinar today, hey, I know where some story maps are and I can go teach with those. Great. That's, to me, level 1. Level 2 is I want to create my own and I want my students to create their own. That's level 2. Both are good. So we're going to build a new story map. I've got, as you can see right here, this link, which I'm going to paste into the chat box. This is on, the link all didn't come through. Hang on. You'll have to copy that whole thing, but let me, I've got a zone in the GeoNet space. And in that zone is postings about how do I use these geographic information tools in education? And this is one of them, the hands-on lesson and the new story maps tool. So this particular, there we go. This particular essay links to what I just pasted in the chat box. And when you go there, you'll get a zip file of all the content for the story map that we're going to build. Now, for those of you that are educators, here's a little educational note. I've had much more success in leading educators and students through a common success rather than say, okay, now that you know what story maps are and how to build them, go forth and do it. There's too many rabbit trails if they do that at the very first. Oh, where are my photos? What story do I want to tell? All that kind of stuff, okay? But in this case, so what I do is I always have people make a common story map, which is what we're going to do together. Feel free to follow along, or if you just want to watch, that's fine too. So let's talk about this ArcGIS platform as we do. Now, so far, all of the things that I've showed you, you don't have to sign in to anything. With this ArcGIS platform, for example, you've got map tools at your fingertips, arcgis.com. And if I modify map, I can add layers, and I can do, for example, world hydro. And if I wanted to teach about watersheds and river basins and river flow, done. I've got a scalable map. And if I zoom into where Nell and I are hanging out in Denver Metro, I've got increasing amounts of data at my fingertips, the streams, and also these dashed lines, which are the watershed boundaries. Very nice. So I've got that at my fingertips. And so that and also the other things that I've showed today, no login required. But now, since we're going to make a story map, you actually do need to sign in the upper right here. So if I go to storymaps.arcgis.com, I can see the story maps that exist, but if I want to actually create one, I need an account because I need to store something somewhere online in this ArcGIS platform. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, how do you get a sign in? Well, if you folks are at a university, chances are 99% probable that your university already has an ArcGIS either departmental or campus-wide license for all this Esri technology. So that's good. If you don't know how to get a hold of the person at your university, just drop me a note. If you're at a school, chances are your school already has one. If not, you can go to the school's page, and if you're the teacher champion that wants to spearhead this at your school, you can go ahead and or at your nature center, you can go ahead and sign up for a free organizational subscription to ArcGIS Online, and that'll get you access to using the story maps. The third thing that I wanted to mention here is if you're not at either one of those places, you can go to our developer site and see on the left side here, developers.arcgis.com, and sign up for free, and you'll get a free account that you can make story maps and share those maps. Okay, so all good. All three of those scenarios. If you're at a government agency or a nonprofit, again, chances are you probably have, your agency has probably already tapped in and signed up your organization to get a account. So I don't want to spend more than that amount of time on how to get an account. Just we'll chat in the Q&A later on about that if you'd like. Okay, so I'm going to start with storymaps.arcgis.com. I'm going to sign in now, and I'm going to sign in with a account. Okay, and this is, again, if you were signing in, you would sign in with your own account. And now I'm going to, I want to create a story. Okay, start a story. Great. So now in my zip file that was tied to the, it's Joseph's hard drive. If you unzip that file, you're going to get all the images and the instructions. And the instructions are in this PDF. I also have it as a doc file. So if you wanted to modify those instructions for something that you were passionate about, hopefully you're interested in landforms, as I am. But no worries if you're not. This is about geomorphology. But you can modify the doc file. That's why I've got both formats there. So I'm looking at the instructions, and I'm going to say, now I'm going to create a new story. Look, my title is a geomorphology field trip. So if I go now to here, you know what's coming next, right, folks? I'm going to tab back and forth between my instructions. And my subtitle is going to be Investigating Glacial and Fluvial Landforms. I mean, what's not to love about glacial and fluvial landforms, right, folks? Okay. And then I'm going to add an image. My image is going to be that zip file, right? It's going to be this sign. I went out in the field with some students from Valparaiso University, and I'm going to add those elements, and I'm building my story map. And everything else is driven from this plus sign. You've probably remembered this from my slide earlier. Every single thing. So if I want a video, I add the video. If I want an image, I add the image. Okay, let's just continue with a couple more elements here, and then I'm going to abandon ship because I think you know where I'm going with this. And so then I've got a quote. So I'm going to add that quote in there. Super. Let's see here. Quote. Great. There we go. And then, okay, coming back to my instructions, I've got a paragraph here, students in geomorphology. I'm just going to go ahead and add a paragraph, and now I've got some of this. So you see where I'm going with this, right, folks? Now, here's the exciting part. Now I'm going to add a map, okay? Because that's what makes these story maps shine, right? Is you're adding, remember my walkability map? Remember that? This one. Remember this thing? It had a interactive map inside of it. That's what distinguishes story maps from just a regular multimedia Prezi or something like that. Remember, it had this interactive map. How do I get that in there? Well, as I explain in my procedures, I'm going to open a separate tab and go to arcgis.com. I'm going to sign in. I'm going to search for a map, a geomorphology field trip in Northwest Indiana. So, okay. So now I'm back on my story map. And notice that I've got, I'm going to go ahead and ditch a few tabs here if you don't mind. Okay, just to, again, keep things a little sane here. Okay, so now I've got my story map started. Here's my walkability map. I'm going to ditch that as well. And some of these things here. Okay, let's see here. How are we doing? Yep, okay, good. So I'm going to go ahead and say, I'm going to add some content here. I'm going to close this, for example. So I've got this right here, just to refresh where we were. Add content block, map, okay? And I'm going to search for a geomorphology field trip in Northwest Indiana. But now that is, I don't want to search, I want to search for web maps, okay? And I'm going to search my maps. I'm going to search this owner JJ Kerski, oops, got to spell it right. And I'm going to go ahead and my favorites. So there we've got it in there. Okay, cool. So there's my geomorphology field trip. And now you can customize this and say, okay, my first instance of having this map inside my story map is I've got my 4, keeping things simple, my 4 field trip sites with my students. So I'm going to kind of adjust the scale. You can see this is at the south side of Lake Michigan. This is the first, one of these locations is the newest national park. Okay, great. So now I've got place map, and notice now, without any coding, I've got this interactive map inside my story map. Very cool. Okay, let's go ahead and add another content block. What's my next instruction here? Okay, I'm going to say overwrite the default caption with the following text, and it's going to span the page break, so I'm going to have to edit that just a little bit. No worries though, no worries though. Going ahead and overwrite this with this, and this is the place I have to do a little editing. Okay, cool. So now I've got a couple of different things. Let's add one more map. Okay, and this is where I'm going to search the maps again. Okay, and they're in my favorites. And this time, I'm hoping you're going to see from this that I've got a web map with my locations of my field trip. In this case, I want not this, not my topo, but I want to look at my input point for my first watershed trace and my second watershed trace and my trace downstream. Ah, look at that. And I don't want the topo map base. So I want it really simple. I want this. I've dropped a point. This is an analytical tool in ArcGIS Online. And where does the water flow? North of the drainage divide and south of the drainage divide, it's actually going to go all the way down to the Mississippi. So I'm going to place that map. And now one more image, and then I'm going to abandon this particular part of the story map. Now I've got the drainage divide. So we went to this location, and there's a kettle. There is a low point on the drainage divide where the ice block, of course, has melted, and you've got this kettle behind. Again, glacial terrain. And what is a drainage divide? So this is the story about, okay, this drainage divide is exactly right here where this photograph was taken, and everything north of this flows into Lake Michigan, and everything south of this flows into the Mississippi River and eventually to the Gulf of Mexico. So it is a major drainage divide, even though in Northwest Indiana it doesn't look like anything like the Rocky Mountains, but it is nevertheless important, and it is a drainage divide. So we have built the beginning of this geomorphology field trip. If we had more time together, we would flesh it out, and eventually what it would look like is as follows. Let me just show you the final result here, folks. If we had had 15 more minutes, 20 more minutes, it would have looked like this, a geomorphology field trip. There's a couple of the photos. Here are the reasons why we created it. You remember this map right at the beginning? Okay, stop one, drainage divide. Great, here's the interactive map about what is a drainage divide. A couple of drawings. Here we are on a moraine. What is a moraine? A couple notes. Here's some of the dunes. Pretty cool stuff. Geologic map, again, from the Living Atlas of the World, so that's where that content comes from, and on down through the story map, okay? One last bit to show you before we exit is a little bit of cultural geography, population pressure around there, topo map base, what is a oxbow lake, and a cutoff meander, analyzing some water quality back in the classroom, and an embedded video from YouTube, okay? So that is the result of the story map, campus map of Valparaiso University. Let's do the following as we wrap up. I wanted to show you a couple of, I think, powerful examples of this as we wrap up our last 2 minutes here. Our chief scientist at Esri, Dawn Wright, she has her science story, no surprise, in a story map. What is spatial analysis, for example? Okay, so she uses story maps, as I do, for quite a few things, but also in her role as chief scientist to really bring about the whole language of science. So wanted to bring that one up. How do I move on from here? This is great, Joseph, but you know, I want to keep going. Okay, there's a story maps blog. There's the education blog on GeoNet, as I mentioned. There are videos. There's a story maps newsletter called Planet Story Maps, which is very informative and very cool. There are MOOCs, massive open online courses that we offer from time to time during the year, and one of them is called Do-It-Yourself Geo Apps, which actually includes story maps. So that is what I had intended to cover. And does anybody have questions, comments, issues, concerns with, I know we've done a lot here today, folks, and I appreciate your attention, and I salute the good work that you folks are doing out there. But we kind of went through different ways to create these things, some examples, why to do it, how to do it. Does anybody have any thoughts on that as we get into the questions and answers here?
It looks like we have one in the comment from John. He says, is there a file size limit on videos?
Well, think about leveraging all of these things in the cloud, okay? So you're not ideally pointing to a video on your device. So if it's online in Vimeo or YouTube or some other place, and it's again, if your story map is public and you want to point to a public video, then no, there's no constraints. But I think it's a good opportunity to mention the following. Just because you can do something in this story maps platform doesn't mean that you should. So sometimes we see a story map can be embedded inside a story map, and that can be embedded inside another story map. So think about, again, the idea of story maps is to keep things pretty simple, to tell a straightforward story. Yes, you can make them pretty complicated, and some issues on our planet are pretty complex, and so they require a decent amount of detail. But again, just because you can embed a story map inside a story map inside a story map doesn't mean you should, because you need to think about your audience and their cognition and so on and so forth. So yes, we have an API, and you can actually get into the JavaScript behind here. This, good question there, John. The developer site is the best way to do that, because we have a series of labs inside here where, oh, teach me how to do this kind of stuff. And some of the labs have the JavaScript on the left side and the map, the particular map in the example, on the right side. So you tweak line 7 of the script and you see, oh, now I've got a legend. You tweak line 11. Oh, now I've got a widget that does this. So you see how the code runs the map. And so when we work with computer science instructors and others at all levels, even at high schools and universities, community colleges, yeah, we want students to actually know how to dig into some of these tools. Now, again, I remember I was mentioning the level 1, level 2, level 1 being, in my view, use existing story maps to teach content, level 2 being create your own. Level 3, in my opinion, is now let's get into the what runs all of these maps. In other words, I don't want to just build things that through the plus sign on the story maps. I want to dig deeper, and I want to actually code these. And so that would be, in my view, level 3. You bet, Jessica. That whole PowerPoint presentation, I will send that over maybe to you, Nell, and that way you can put it up somewhere on the CAEE site. How would that be?
That sounds perfect.
Awesome. Okay, folks. Oh, you folks you're so nice. Thanks for these comments. So yeah, these are all web mapping tools and they are all connected. So the one I was showing at the very beginning, I want you to think about this. Go to the next step at some point. I would start small, use some existing story maps, then build one of your own. A nice way to get started, in my opinion, is if you start with your own CV. Ooh, so here's my story map on my story, my own personal story. So there's nothing wrong with having a regular CV, but if you use story maps as sort of your excuse to kind of get into the tools, you can put geeky photos, like I've got here, for example. But the point is, make sure you include a map in there, like this one. So here are some of the places I've taught and worked and so on and so forth. And obviously it's interactive because it's inside the story map. But this is a nice way to start, is start with your own CV. Again, don't abandon your traditional CV or resume, but make a story map. And for those of you that are students, it is a nice, or those of you that are looking for, future employment, it's nice to be able to show your potential employer that, hey, I know something about web mapping, web GIS, because look, here's my own CV as a story map. So that's a nice way to get started. Oh, thanks, Antonio. Awesome. With this. All right, super.
Joseph, I have a question. This is Nell. So
Yes.
I'm loving how accessible this is and how it's really cross-disciplinary. Just some anecdotes or feedback. What are the students' takeaways from this? What are their experiences? Are they geeking out about it as much as maybe I am right now?
Yeah, here's a story that some educators that we know up in Canada are using, not just story maps, but a whole interconnected set of tools that you have at your fingertips in the ArcGIS platform. So for example, the students up in Saskatchewan were looking at First Nations, Native Americans, but in their case, First Nations treaties, and understanding space, place. And so they used a story map, as you can see, but they're also getting out in the field and collecting data, and they're analyzing it. Look, they're getting out in canoes. So the idea is these tools are not just isolated. They're not just some little app that's on Joseph's computer or on. There's nothing wrong with those kinds of things, but these are all connected. And so the one that I showed here, this walkability one, is I've got a survey inside there. I've got the ArcGIS Online map, and then I've got this dashboard. And so that's just an example of story map, ArcGIS Online map, dashboard, and survey inside the story map. So it's 4 tools in one. And so I encourage you folks that are thinking about, okay, how do I get started with this? Don't start with connecting 4 tools. Start small. Again, storymaps.arcgis online, see what content is available, and then step 2, create your own. Step 3, have your students create a story map on a project that you've already got them using maybe traditional means of communication. Instead of having them make a PowerPoint, have them make a story map of a certain issue. So circling back to you, Nell, what I've found is that students actually, when they create this, number one, they know that people in the professional world are using these tools, and so that lends a little bit of, wow, I better be serious about what I'm doing here because I'm using a professional tool. And the second element is, and I like to show them, job ads where, okay, transportation engineer, business analyst, city planner, right, environmental assessment coordinator, etc. They oftentimes require in the Nature Conservancy, in EPA, etc., that GIS, that you know something about it. It may not be your 100% of your job, but it is an important component because all of these environmental issues have the where questions. So, and last bit on what you're saying, Nell, yeah, I have noticed that there is a very high level of engagement. But for those of you that are instructors, you need to be a little bit on the, hey, let's learn this together, because you won't know, as I don't know, everything there is to know about geographic information systems. You have to be willing to teach with something that you're not completely familiar with. But rest assured that the students will take to this. Your role is still important because you're the one framing the the inquiry, you're framing the whys of where, you're getting them to think spatially and about scale and about interconnectedness. So you're framing the issues, but on the technical pieces, you don't need to be an expert in this. So I just wanted to reassure you that, yeah, we've gone through a lot today, but you can do it, and there are lots of good stories like the one I showed here with the educators over in Canada. Okay?
And it looks like there might be one more question. Is there a place to download a larger variety of base maps?
Yeah, let me show you Living Atlas. I mentioned this a couple times. This is my starting point with if I need watersheds, biomes, base maps. Yes, this is where I would go. We talked about the coronavirus earlier. Sadly, this is the grim details. So this is the starting point for content, mapped content, and this isn't the end all be all. So, you know, if you want, your local community probably has a open data site, or if they don't have an open data site, they might have a GIS department where they've got some data that you can obtain if you needed something local. And that it's not in the Living Atlas. There's some local data in here, but it's not every single theme for every single community around the world. But there's an awful lot here, so rest assured that you don't have to create all these. Sure, the water quality, the dissolved oxygen, the conductivity, the pH in the pond outside your school building is probably not in here, right? So you're going to need to collect that and then map it, and then again, you could create a story map around that. But yeah, no shortage of content, unlike the old clunky days of GIS that some of you have experienced with me, like Steve from Sheridan. We go way back into the 20th century, right, Steve, with this, and it was arduous. Getting the data was a huge part of any project because it was just so difficult to get in the right map projection, make sure it was available, and that you had access to it, and so on. I'm not saying that it's all plug and play and it's super easy, but it is very compelling, as Nell was mentioning, and also doable in education.
Awesome. Well, if anybody has some last minute questions, feel free to unmute yourself or throw them into the chat. Joseph, thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Well, thank you folks for being here. Much appreciated. And again, if there's anything I can do at all to help you in your journey, because it is a journey. And I'm not talking about the 80s band journey. I mean the geospatial journey that we're all embarked on. And I'm happy to be a resource for you. Again, you know, the videos, the you know, if you truly want to be tortured, go ahead and, you know, get my Twitter posts daily about this kind of stuff. You know, but again, I just encourage you, sometime this semester, do something with this. Because if you wait till fall or summer, you're like, what did Joseph and Nell talk about way back in February? It'll be a lot more difficult. You know, it's kind of like learning a language, right? Yeah, so I would start small, but start. All right, folks, map on and go ahead and be spatial.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Nell, for your support.
Thanks, Joseph. Take care.